far as I've understood it, that's not only correct, but it's also because the fracking industry was pre-war not very profitable in the first place. And sure, they're getting a boost by having them ship LNG terminals over to Germany and all that. But generally speaking, American oil exports benefit from high prices. So releasing strategic reserves in order to get down global prices wouldn't make much sense. But to kind of have a little bit more internal control, yeah, I would fully agree with Drew for the reasons mentioned.
And the strategic reserve actually is not that much. Like the what they released was like only for like the usage, I believe 3 days in United States. So so I don't think we should read too much into the release of strategic reserve.
Yeah.
That is actually minimal. It's actually meant for war. It's not really meant for the domestic consumption.
What do you mean minimal? Have you seen how much they've released and over what time period? Also, if it was an internal political measure, they could just subsidize it.
Yeah, so that's why people criticize the division, because the amount that they release hardly helps in that sense.
Yeah.
But it actually but it's a waste of the reserve to release them in that sense, because usually I believe the reserve is meant for critical disasters like maybe wartime. It's not really meant to release to the public to spend it. And it's like they use so much oil every day that the reserve that they release is hardly makes a dent, as far as I can understand.
I see what you mean. I misunderstood. I thought you meant they hardly released any, but you're saying it didn't really change so much.
It's like enough for like 3 days. From my memory, it's like 3 days worth of.
And I think the why, to answer your question, why they didn't just throw in a subsidy? I think it's because for a subsidy you can't just do it with an executive order. You need something that it's not an action that can just be taken, like releasing the oil. You need to set up a whole system and then it has long-term effects, whereas this is a one-off executive order that Biden can just say, okay, do this. So it's more of political.
I have some stats to share when it comes to Russia's oil market, and this is a Bloomberg report that just came out on 24th February. Anybody can go and find it. The title is "Russia Sold Oil Far Above Price Cap, Researchers Say." And basically what the report, it's behind a paywall, but the report says that all this time, December, January, February, Russia has actually sold oil for on average price of $74 per barrel. And the only port where the price cap was actually taken into account was the Baltic port of Russia, and where the price was 59.84, and Druzhba pipeline, it was 61.56. Druzhba pipeline is the one that goes through Ukraine, and they just recently stopped the supply to Poland through it. I don't know if the rest of the supplies are still going, but the pipeline through Ukraine was currently still working up till 24th February as well. So we have to take this into account when it comes to the oil and the not necessarily gas, but the oil market of Russia. And I think I agree with all of your points about how US is the strategic reserve was more for internal matters, but not for external. For externally, they have actually, what they have done is that they have lifted some sanctions off of Venezuela's oil, and what they're doing is Venezuela is supplying them for domestic purposes, and they're selling their own oil to Europe and everywhere else for external purposes. So that's what's been happening.
Profit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's also a signaling mechanism associated with releasing the oil, because it's like dividends in the stock market. You show it because you want to signal that this company is doing well. So it's not about how much oil you release. It's about that you are going to support the price. You're not going to let it go to 100, 110, because crude oil price is heavily dependent on speculators. There's a lot of leverage trading which happens. So you see crude moving from 90 to 110 in hours. Honestly, if you look at how crude oil price was moving between February and April of 2022, you would find that price was moving between 113 to 97 on the same day. And stock markets were responding immediately. So a lot of money is involved in this. The moment you know that we're going to put as much oil out there to suppress the price, the speculators get out of the market because they know it's being manipulated. So part of it may or may not work. That's finance, but at least there is some signaling strategy also to that.
Yeah, but that's quite a silly strategy because from what I understand, it's almost empty, right? Yeah, they are reserves. So and it's it's an amount that people report. So when you have a strategy to basically defend the pack, basically, you typically show trillions of dollars sitting at the ready to fight the speculators, and the speculators will decide, well, I can't defeat that, so I'm not going to try. Whereas here they're showing a half-empty storage that will be gone in a week if they released it, and then they have nothing else to. So that will be a very juicy target to attack actually, because they know the limit.
That's true. I mean, if you look at how the Indian Reserve Bank defends the Indian rupee against sharp changes, it does the same thing. It sells dollars or it buys dollars, trying to curb the volatility. Now, I know that I think George Soros made a lot of money directly by the British government doing it for the pound, defending it. So yeah, you can make a lot of money if you get such bets, right? Because ultimately, market forces. So yeah, it's silly. You're right about that.
Yeah. George Soros did it to Thailand. He attacked it until the peg broke, and then he basically rode the wave down, and that basically destroyed Thailand's economy for a while. It was quite it's quite an evil thing to do.
One more thing that I would like to add to the point I made about Venezuela's oil. U.S. has actually lifted the sanctions only in certain way that only U.S. can import their oil. So EU can't just go to Venezuela directly and be like, hey, we're gonna buy some oil from you. It's just the U.S.
Rules for you, not for me, eh?
Uh-huh.
Oh, I wanted to chip in on what you said about the oil price discount and whatnot. It's a classic case of the Western media picking and choosing the numbers and then broadcasting it. So before they were saying that oil was being discounted by $20 or something. So I went to look it up. So how the pricing works is China doesn't buy any oil from Russia. Chinese refineries, they're individual corporations that each individual refinery individually negotiates a price with the supplier, in this case with Russia, and each of them have their own discount. So the large refineries, there's large refineries in one area. Most of the discounts were like between $2, $5, and $10. So there was one, I think, a small refinery that got a special discount because of some reasons. And then it was like a huge discount, and so all the Western media basically took the biggest discount and said everybody in China bought at that low price, which is wrong. You only represent a very small volume, but it is that's how the Western media portrays that Russia is losing and Russia is losing all revenues and all whatnot. Yeah.
I wanted to come back to one point. So this is the question that I made earlier with Abhinav, is that what if what it does India profit from it? And I just thought of a few things. For example, BRICS. I think that this war has also had two big benefits for India. I think it kind of increased the value of keeping India on their side. So on one side, US is like, yeah, take my side, and or the West is like, take our side, and on the other side, the Russian and China side is where India can do things like BRICS, or like make all sorts of arrangements. So I think that's one part where India has gotten a political win, and recently, like Blinken and Lavrov also met in India for the first time since war started. This was like 2 days ago in the G20 summit, and that's another big political win. And if like the war does come to an end on a short term, I think India could be the one to broker it. So there's been lots of benefits. Plus, India has like all of these deals that India is making. India has had the opportunities. Let's say they come out with a BRICS currency, like they have had the little sneaking opportunity to make all these changes without coming out as very anti-US. So they have been able to play the both sides because of this. So that's one huge benefit that I see India has gotten, that not many other countries will probably even have the chance to do. So in that sense, I think coping, Norway and India are very different in that sense, because I think, in my opinion, India does have that political freedom compared to Norway, because I don't think Norway, if it decides to go against US, can do that. I think India has kind of placed itself in that strategic position. In the point of political and economic independence, sovereignty that we were talking about, we can go back to the original topic now. How would a post-war economy of Ukraine and Russia look like? So let's start with Ukraine. Do you guys think that Ukraine will, let's say the war ends and they get to keep their country, will Ukraine remain politically or economically sovereign um, to make their own decisions? Do you guys think that?
Well, assuming there is no political change, right, and it's somehow they find a way to stabilize internally. The biggest problem Ukraine will have is it's got this huge debt to repay. It's all these money that the West has sent it, or not even money, but all the weapons and aid and whatnot. They all come with a condition that it has to be repaid. So what I think will happen basically is, assuming that Ukraine doesn't get back Donbas, then it's got nothing to repay that loan with. It's got nothing to pay back that pay back all the loans and cost of the weapons with. Assuming that Ukraine does get back Donbas, then I think what will happen is that Ukraine will simply be tasked to extract all the raw materials underlying Ukraine, and then use that as repayment for all its basically war reparations. There is no way out for them in this. There's no win for them. There's no rainbow sunshine and rainbow scenario for them after this. Even if they win and they kick Russia all the way out to the border and get back Crimea, they still will be enslaved economically to the West for the next 50 years at least. Yeah.
So if I can bring something to that, which may or may not dispense with it or not, but well, I think the presumption that if they get back Donbass and everything, I think we should make I don't think that I think that is extremely unlikely. The same goes for Crimea and everything. I would also consider it as extremely unlikely in any form of political settlement. I think it's also worth noting that when it comes to Ukraine being indebted and so forth, there are a couple of aspects here. One thing is all the financial aid that has been committed to Ukraine, and if we say in a post-war scenario, it wouldn't be unreasonable to say that the military aid, which is quite substantial, be converted to civilian aid for reconstruction. And I think it was I forgot what was the name of it. NDICI. It's on Global Europe. It's a development program which was started in 2021, and it has likewise, like Norway, committed to supporting Ukraine in a variety of ways until 2027. And here they made a quite an interesting note in that, which is to quote, create concrete projects to support our geopolitical agenda. So that you can say that, like, okay, if Norway and the EU have committed, and we're talking about here like 30-40 billion dollars to Ukraine for the next following years, and we say that they actually stick to it, then actually there is a lot for reconstruction for Ukraine to kind of get back. It could be debt relief and so forth, rebuilding key industries that will enable them to get back on their foot. And we can of course argue whether or not that will happen. I see Drew is finding it unlikely. I am not too confident on it, but that is what we have to work on right now. That is the official commitment from the public, from the authorities, the relevant authorities. I don't know about the United States, but I think we can dispense with them because they have a tendency to just cut loose and go. So, like, that's okay.
Well, no. If Ukraine gets peace, the United States will have a huge rebuilding program for Ukraine, and there will be billions and billions pumped into Ukraine for the purpose of reconstruction.
Because
definitely.
BlackRock and so
that's
forth,
what they did. That's what they did in Iraq. But look at the results. $2 trillion was spent in Iraq. $2 trillion. That's a shit ton of money. Do you see any Iraqi millionaires walking around?
No.
Yeah.
No, but
so
but
where did the
brings...
$2 trillion go? When money gets spent into a country, the money supposedly goes into the country. There should be a bunch of Iraqi billionaires walking around. $2 trillion. Where are they? There are no Iraqi billionaires. There are no Iraqi millionaires.
Well,
the money
and I think
doesn't come up.
You are pointing something that tends to be the case, but one thing that's worth noting here,
when historically accurate. That's what happened.
Yes, indeed.
I have no confidence that.
I'm not disagreeing on that. If we take it in the isolated incidents that I kind of proposed here, it's not limited to that alone, because what you're saying, I think, is a natural consequence. What will happen is that not only would the EU, Norway probably included, have strings attached to it, and they will try to use it as a debt instrument. The US, of course, will try to use it as a debt instrument to develop the agricultural industry and so forth that they already have there. But there is one thing worth noting then is it's not just NATO and US. In the post-war Ukraine, they may very well be, like I said, they have to have all their tariffs reduced. They have to sell most of their public assets and everything to kind of make ends meet. They're tied up to the IMF to a large extent, and I will get to the IMF really soon. But when it comes to just geopolitical rivalry, it's worth noting that if not Russia, which may very well be denied any avenue for assisting Ukraine because that will be considered soft power subversion, China, one could say the same argument for China, but it will be to a lesser degree. And they already have the Belt and Road Initiative tied to Odessa, if I'm not mistaken. So if if Ukraine were to be heavily indebted by the West, be it because of what they already have accrued, or because of the indebtment that is going to be occurring afterwards, China could actually exploit that in the same way as they have done in Africa. Namely, they propose a better option, a better solution, which they can buy out the debts from the West, and then they can facilitate infrastructure projects that they themselves actually want to happen, and thus aid in the reconstruction of China. What your thoughts on that? And afterwards, I will introduce the IMF.
I want to answer to Drew. There have been past projects of United States per se in Japan, South Korea, which you can argue they have succeeded. So there is that. I know Iraq and Afghanistan, they didn't work out when it comes to rebuilding their economy. In Afghanistan, apparently they created a court. They spent billions in making a court system work. Afghanistan didn't buy into that idea. But when we're talking about Ukraine, we're talking about like a more westernized country. So Japan and South Korea may be a little better examples to look at rather than Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's just me playing the devil's advocate here. Toby, I would like to know your views on this. The question was that at the end of this war, in the first case scenario, if let's say Ukraine gets to keep their country and there's a political settlement and Russia gets Donbass and Crimea, in that scenario, do you think that Ukraine will get to keep its political and economic sovereignty or no?
Political and economic sovereignty. I'm not sure what either of those things mean, but I would say I've recently read the UN and EU report on refugees from Ukraine into Europe. It's sober reading. Fully 1/3 of the refugees that have fled Ukraine into Europe have no intention of going back. And that's even if we do get like a best case scenario. The humanitarian crisis in Ukraine can't be understated. The Ukraine war has become an absolute slaughterhouse. Russia's aim of destroying the military, that means killing soldiers. It doesn't mean anything else at this stage. They are slaughtering the Ukrainian army with artillery in the cheapest way possible. They're not trying to seize ground. They're keeping the war over in the east where their supply lines are short and where Ukraine and NATO's supply lines are long. And they are just slaughtering men. Now, the thing about the refugees in Europe, if you have a look at the data there, over 90% of them are women between the ages of 18 and 65. That's because the men are required to be conscripted. You know, despite the British fantasy that Ukraine is united and volunteering for that war, it's a meat grinder, and they are conscripting everybody and feeding them into the Russian artillery. The women of that country, fully at 1/3, don't intend to go back, even if there's a country to go back to. 1/3 say they will go back, and 1/3 aren't sure, right? And so unless Ukraine can be rebuilt with a functioning electricity grid and with a government that respects their rights and isn't making them jump on one foot and waving a flag around, that other 1/3 won't go back either. So I don't know if Ukraine is going to be able to be repopulated after this war to the point where it can function as a useful economy. So, yeah, the humanitarian aspect of what has happened to Ukraine, it's diabolical is what it is. It's been an absolute slaughter. It continues to be a slaughter. And I think that's you know, Russia is putting that country to the sword, right? And I don't want to wave the Putin flag and say what a great thing that is either. Like I can hear the arguments that they see this as necessity because they're next, and it's true. NATO has openly threatened Russia. It has openly threatened Russia. Ukraine openly threatened Russia. You get Polish politicians talking about the fact that the Russians are inherently evil and that Russia must be broken up, and you get Western statesmen saying that Putin must be killed. So I understand why Russia is doing it, but that shouldn't distract us from the absolute brutality of what is happening. So if we're going to talk about the economics of Ukraine, I do think we have to talk about like the most important economic ingredient in any economy, which is human capital, because Ukraine is being put to the sword, and most of their women folk do not want to go back, and there are reasons for that, right? There are Ukraine, despite being hailed as a wonderful democracy and the exemplar of all of our Western values, whatever that means, it wasn't. You know, I did business with Ukrainians and the rest of it. Like it wasn't a friendly, polite society. It was beset by corruption, years and years of brutal corruption. That has an impact on the psyche of the people. I can see why people would want to get out of Ukraine and stay out. So unless they can rebuild the post-war Ukraine into some kind of attractive country and get the human capital back in there, yeah, I think it's going to be a very hard row to hoe to get any kind of economic returns. But at the same time, I don't think anyone cares. You know, if people wanted the economic potential of Ukraine, they would have just accepted Ukraine into the EU. I mean, we forget Ukraine was denied entry into the EU repeatedly. This is before the war. They asked, right? Poland didn't want them. Most of Europe didn't want them, right? So this idea that there's going to be all this largesse and that everybody's going to invest all of their money wherever that's going to come from, yeah, I'm not convinced. Maybe I'm just like a cynical person that shouldn't be listened to, and that's probably good advice. But I really do see this as being a contest between the EU and NATO. I see this as being America and England trying to keep Europe, the EU, inside the OECD family and stopping it breaking away. Because when we talk about the post-war situation, it's going to be a situation of blocks, right? Where we can already see blocks forming, like the Soviet Union and the Western Bloc. And the question for the OECD is, does the OECD fracture? Does Europe become Eurasia, where Germany and France team up with Russia in an energy and industrial alliance and form their own bloc, then leaving the OECD as Oceania, with mostly the Anglo countries and their colonies. So I really do see the struggle that's going on in Europe as being a struggle between, it's a struggle for Europe, right? It's a struggle for the EU. And so I don't think anyone cares about Ukraine. This is one of the things, it's really disingenuous for people to say that Ukraine is a beacon of Western values and those people are all fighting for Western values and we really care about them. Nobody cares. That country has been put to the sword and it's going to continue to be put to the sword because Russia is making an example of them. And the Baltics should be absolutely terrified.
And I want to add also, in terms of, the kind of aid, the financial aid or military aid that is sent to Ukraine and where the Ukraine owe all the debts, there is actually most of it, there's actually no much cost involved for the countries that actually contributed all this assistance. You're giving old weapons, old ammunitions that is useless. No, you're just sitting there in the storage. When you give it to the Ukrainians, there's no cost. Maybe only transportation cost, unless some of the loans. But most of these money loans, financial, it doesn't go to Ukraine. Also, most of them they actually goes to giving it to the European countries that contributed the weapons, to kind of like buy it away from them. And
it's on a valuation basis. Like, okay, this AK is $3,000, so now you owe me $3,000.
And this $3,000 is not even given to Ukraine. It's given to like maybe the smaller
money isn't
given, states or whatever.
They give the gun, and now you owe me $3,000
to Belgium or whatever. Then and this money stays within the Western economies. So it's basically just there's no cost in it. So in that sense, which is I can understand why Toby said that there is nobody cares about Ukraine in the sense that even if the Ukrainian country fail to pay, the Western world will not collapse due to the money that is gone, because there's no money gone. It's all made up.
That's right. I agree with Wyatt completely.
I have a fairly strong point I would like to make here, and I don't think it's something that is being echoed by anybody. I've not heard anybody say this, but okay. So we've all heard about why Russia is justified in invading Ukraine, or because the West instigated it, or because Ukraine attacked Donbass and whatnot. But I mean, if I look at it from a neutral perspective, when all this started when Bush stood at a conference in 2008 in Bucharest and said, Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO, and Putin then said, this is my red line. You're not going to cross it. Neither Georgia or Ukraine will join NATO. Then I'm not going to allow it. So what did Russia do after that? In a few months after that, they invaded Georgia and kicked out its pro-Western president then, who wanted to join NATO. So that's Russia's tool. That's Russia's hammer. It thinks that, okay, this is the right thing to do to stop another country from joining NATO. So, I mean, it could have done a lot of other things. I mean, if its red line is that Ukraine shouldn't join NATO, shouldn't it have taken more steps to protect its pro-Russian the Ukrainian president at the time and prevent the 2014 coup. I mean, this is a country that's right beside them. It speaks its language. To me, it feels like it's like a student saying, I want to get an A on this test, and then he goes home and watches TV, and then cries about it when he doesn't get an A on the test. You know, if you are saying this is your red line, we should be taking a lot more steps to protect it. I mean, if they had just served Victoria Nuland, who was there several times in Ukraine in 2014, a nice cup of Putin blend tea, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians would still be alive today. You know?
I think that's absolutely right, Drew, and I think that's why they're putting Ukraine to the sword. I think that they are going to. I think they've decided. I think the Russians have decided we've made a catastrophic mistake, right? We've been playing too nice for too long, and so now we're going to show the West what war means, right? War means a stack of bodies a mile high, and that's what they're doing. They're stacking bodies, right? They're not even trying to take territory.
And all these,
they're just stacking bodies in Ukraine. And they're not even talking about stopping either. They want unconditional surrender from Ukraine. That's what demilitarization and denazification means. That means we're going to stack bodies there until we get the result we want. And I think it's exactly. I think you're right, and that's why I think there's been a massive shift in Russia. I think that Russia was very interested in partnership with the West and to get rid of Soviet communism. And there was a big feeling in Russia that, hey, we're not the USSR anymore, so we can have peace. And I think that's gone now. That's gone. When Russia looks at NATO now, and frankly, when any of us look at NATO now, like this idea that NATO have any principles at all except making war for money, I mean, you have to be a simpleton to believe that now. We've seen Iraq, we've seen Libya, we've seen Afghanistan, we've seen Kosovo. And NATO can't be stopped. NATO is a war profit machine, and Russia is on the chopping block. And so I think that this is what we're seeing now is I think you're right. I think Russia is culpable. Russia stood back for so long, and they invited NATO in. They were weak in NATO's eyes. And so NATO believed they could do whatever they want. And so as a consequence, what we're seeing is an absolutely diabolical situation.
You can't fight one evil with another evil, you know. Like you said, and I fully agree with you, these are people that Russia is slaughtering. This demilitarization is basically programmers, you know, business developers, shopkeepers, taxi drivers. They're getting shelled and killed in Ukraine. All these were regular people, you know. So I strongly disagree with this tactic of Russia, even though it's effective.
Well, what were they supposed to do? Were they supposed to roll over and wait for the Orange Revolution to break their country up?
No. I actually think, because as far as I know, the Russians had several other means they could do. One of them would actually be to simply cut the gas supply to Europe. And so, like, you stop sending weapons to Ukraine, you stop encouraging them to break the Minsk agreement by conducting, because they were readying for an offensive in the Donbass, which was a clear breach of the Minsk agreement. And they said, like, dude, you guys don't want to go ahead and do that. We're just going to close the pipeline. Which I'm not sure if that would have preempted Biden, but because, you know, they would have no reason to blow it up since the Russians publicly state, we are going to shut this down if you don't stop sending weapons and so forth. But I didn't see the Russians doing many of those kind of things. They just said, like, red line, we urge you to stop. Okay, now we're mustering by the borders. Like making it clear
even in the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians believed that all they had to do was to show overwhelming force and that the Ukrainians would surrender. Right? That's what all that nonsense around Kiev was like. And that was very poor. That was bad intelligence, and people lost their jobs in Russian intelligence because they were still telling this fantasy that peace was possible.
But
and that's gone now.
Yeah, we know that, but the point is that you kind of pointed out what was the Russians supposed to do before such a scenario was entertained.
Like Bruce said, they should have protected their government, their client government in Kiev before it got out of hand. They should never have allowed NATO to turn Ukraine into a staging base
But
I
yeah,
don't
the
know what
pipelines
reaction
could have been
against it.
leveraged. The oil could have been leveraged. You can say you are now committing hostile acts towards Russia, and so economic cooperation is now ceasing until you stop breaking the Minsk agreement. But they didn't do
I would
anything.
agree with
They
Drew. I think that was a big mistake by Russia.
Yeah,
think
but that's what exactly I'm
answer-
also saying. It's a big mistake because, as far as I can tell, unless I'm mistaken, the Russians didn't actually make any. They had a range of options they could have at least exhausted. Whether they would have worked or not is a different thing. But they did have other options that they didn't seem to be trying. And you can say they were archaic by saying, "Oh no, well you guys are doing this, so now we're just going to shut it." It will be perceived from the outside world. Of course, it will be spun as, "Oh, look, Russia is coercing Europe and blah blah, coercing Ukraine and all that kind of stuff."
Yeah.
But what is that compared to
Yeah.
Russia invaded Ukraine, right?
Yeah, Russia would never have done that.
Yes, as well.
It
I
is
mean,
a huge source of its foreign revenues, and even
that's the
before. Sorry,
The
Abhinav?
point is, how would Russia be able to survive even an year
Exactly.
keeping sanctions on the rest of the world? Russian economy is almost entirely oil and gas. So NATO can afford to sit and say that we are imposing these sanctions. Russia can't. I mean, the only way they're able to survive right now is because they're selling oil to India. India wasn't even a buyer 5 years ago.
Right.
So
But they
they could have created these lines, but 5 years ago they were negotiating Nord Stream 2.
Okay, so Russia cutting down the gas and oil supply immediately brings up the prices, which meant that they could, in practice, have done something similar to India and all that they have been doing anyways.
Yeah, we're
That's-
analyzing
answer
based
that.
on
The only
hindsight.
difference is that they're doing it before any outbreak of war instead of after, because after the
I
outbreak
think-
of war, we see what happens. So why
They're in a-
didn't they consider it? It seems.
But they're in an oil block with the Saudi Arabians and everybody else as well. It's not as if they can unilaterally take decisions on oil. It's they're able to do this right now because they're at war. This is a special circumstance, that's understood. In 2015-16, if they just took Minsk seriously, I don't think anybody would take the Russian threat seriously at all.
Yeah.
Like Germans hate it. Germany would be very unhappy, but everybody hates the Germans anyway. They'd be quite
Well-
happy with the Germans being pissed.
Well, we are analyzing the situation with hindsight. We saw that after the sanctions were put in, that Russia then diverted its oil flows to China and India, but none of this was guaranteed to happen. They didn't have this knowledge that their economy will survive the cutting off of oil and gas to Europe. They themselves were extremely worried that their economy will collapse due to the sanctions, and they put in a lot of work to make sure that didn't happen. And what they put in worked, luckily. But there was something else that Russia could have done, because in 2019, our dear Zelensky got elected, and he got elected with a huge popular support of 71%, based on a campaign main primary campaign promise of implementing Minsk to maintain the peace and also to reduce corruption. But what happened was Zelensky is an actor hired by a guy called Kolomoisky, right? Is this billionaire that started his TV show that made him famous, and then used Zelensky as the face of his new political party. So what the US did in 2019 was they started a case on Kolomoisky, because Zelensky actually won the popular election that kicked out the US puppet that was installed in 2014. So what was Russia's FSB doing, or whatever its intelligence thing? Why did they let the CIA kick out Kolomoisky? Why didn't they do it themselves? Why didn't they become the puppet masters? It would have been a seamless transition. Zelensky, all his campaign promises were exactly what Russia wanted. Zelensky is a Russian-speaking Jew. I mean, it would have been perfect to use him as their puppet. Why didn't they take over instead of letting the US CIA take over as the puppet masters? So it's there are things that Russia could have done to prevent all of this. So,
Because Russia is
we're
not
horribly off topic, but it's just something I want to get off my
They don't have a
chest.
CIA to do it.
Yeah, no, I'm inclined to agree with Drew. Like, I do think Russia has done extraordinarily poorly with especially when you consider that Ukraine's supposed to be their brotherly country, right?
Exactly.
It's like,
they're people they're
right,
supposed to care about.
And on this note, like, I'm going to criticize Putin here, right? Like, one of the reasons that Putin is so popular is because he was very, very lucky. When he came to power, oil prices went through the roof, which meant Russia suddenly had money again. That wasn't because he was a genius. He came along at the right time, right? In the 2000s, Russia was flush with cash because of oil. They didn't share any of that with their dear brothers in Ukraine, right? They rebuilt their own country, but as far as they were concerned, our dear brothers in Ukraine can go to hell, right? And so I think Drew is right. There's a lot of blame to be put on the Russians for ignoring what was going on in Ukraine and allowing the situation in Ukraine to develop as it did.
Because
so, the pro-Russian crowd are going to hate us for this, and they're going to say Drew's got an agenda, and he probably does. But I think he's right.
Just to placate the pro-Russian crowd, we're not saying that Russia is to blame. We're saying that everyone is to blame. It takes two hands to clap here. The US is to blame, Ukraine is to blame, Russia is to blame. Everybody needs to screw up somehow for such a huge debacle to happen.
Now, I will add one clear
well
thing.
said, Drew. Yeah.
I will add one clear thing that everyone should understand when we're talking about Ukraine winning, Russia winning, and all that. And I refer to this random person, that was his name on the open mic, from Russia, and I think he put it the best. Both Russia and Ukraine lost as soon as this war begun. They both lost, like one way or the other. Sure, there are some gains here, some gains there with special interest groups, but ultimately speaking, no matter who wins, they have kind of both lost in many ways. They could have solved this in a way that did not resort to war. They could have fought other bilateral agreements. And sure, we know there are a lot of things around it that prevented that from happening or made it difficult. But the fact of the matter is, as far as I perceive it at least, they both lost as soon as they entered the war. And that is why Norway is gaining. So the longer this war goes, if you are a Norwegian and if you want to be like very nationalistic and everything, you drop this pro-Ukraine stuff and you go pro-Norway, or you go pro-war, because the longer this war lasts, the more it's going to benefit us. Now, and if you think that that's immoral, if you think that is immoral, and you think that maybe there's more to it, maybe that is not how Norway should be identified, well, welcome to the DPA panel. You may come on here and disagree if you think so.
China and US are the main beneficiaries of this whole thing.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
I would like to segue into the US interests on this, because if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, how much money went into development. So Drew made a point about money being spent in Iraq. The figure is actually not $2 trillion. I think the amount you're quoting includes military aid. And that's what I read recently. And I went through an interview by somebody who was a minister in the Afghan government. They quoted that $67 billion was spent on Afghanistan's reconstruction and development between 2001 and 2021. So in 20 years, 67 billion was disbursed, 80 billion was committed. If you look at how much money was spent in Afghanistan, $2.3 trillion was spent in the war, of which 850 billion is salaries, 800 billion on military contracts and all that. The actual details are not relevant. What's important is that it's not even 1/20th of the cost of the war. It's less than 5%. It's like 3%. If you look at Iraq's figures as well, it's the same. Actually, if we look at Ukraine's economics, you would see that all its primary institutions, which were demolished in the 1990s because it went from communism to capitalism, it was crying for money, for investment and for creating into tertiary industries. Because if you look at the Ukrainian economy, it's mostly agriculture and it's mining. And the mining area has been conquered by Russia now, but the rest is agricultural and it's really good land for agriculture. But how much money do you make from agriculture? If you look at Japan and South Korea, which Aki brought into the equation a little while ago, they're different because they're basically based on human capital. So South Korea received US aid, but an interesting thing about South Korea is even as the war was raging, students were studying. People went to university even as bombs raged around them. The government didn't stop spending money on education. In 1949, in 1950, Japan, people worked till death. They literally have the word karoshi, I think, for overwork till death. This is not comparable to Ukraine, which was the most corrupt nation on the planet. I think that's Wall Street, Bloomberg's, somebody, but basically, it's not really comparable because if you look at U.S. aid to Korea, I think they received no aid from the U.S. after 1965. So they literally sold human hair, went to the Middle East, and repatriated money from there to get forex. That's how South Korea went in 10 years from an economy with its top 10 exports being tertiary, being primary products, including human hair, to secondary products to tertiary. So it took 10 to 15 years, and in the 1970s, they were mostly selling tertiary. India is still selling like half of its top 10 exports are in the primary to primary, and the rest are secondary. It's not in tertiary. So that's why India is not there as a top economy, whereas Korea was able to do that in 15, 20 years. This is not comparable because in Ukraine, it's been 20, 30 years, and they're still primarily a primary product economy, which means that their transition also is going to be that much more difficult. They have no institutions to look back upon. The Russians, even if they build any institutions, they're going to probably make it the same way that they've made in Russia, which again has stagnated over the last decade. So it's not exactly the best model for development. And the West clearly spends $2.3 trillion on war armament, but less than 100 billion. It's probably going to do the same in Ukraine. And we already know they're going to take that money back, which they've literally sold weapons which would be thrown away and charged its cost price as aid, which is financially like I want to tear my hair.
Not even cost price. It's like the export price of a totally new weapon.
It costs
But,
them. They don't have to maintain those weapons anymore. It costs them less to throw these to Ukraine. And
well, I mean, if we're talking about a post-war thing, then the military facet we can kind of convert. We can, just for the sake of argument, say are converted into civilian use. And I would like to kind of go back to what Toby said about the demographics, because yes, I would agree with him to a large extent. That's true. Let's say only 1/3 of the Ukrainian women went back. But we should also remember that it is a significantly smaller population. If we were to, hypothetically speaking, for the sake of argument, freeze the borders where they are now and just set that is it. However they manage to get a political agreement, that's how it's set. Well, then Ukraine as a smaller country would, maybe not have such a tough time recuperating as they otherwise would have. And when it comes to like finances and so forth, I thought it would perhaps be interesting for some to that we bring in the issue of the IMF and more specifically the SDR. So I'm going to just explain very briefly like what the SDRs are. They are short for special drawing rights, and they're basically just money allocated from the IMF. It's just made out of thin air, and this is debt-free money with no strings attached, like from the outset, that is, and then we'll get into it. And the allocation tends to be the highest amount to the richest countries. Now, that being said, SDRs is a form of currency that you cannot actually use directly. You will have to first convert it into a hard currency. One of the ways this works is that the countries that are allocated the least SDRs and are also cash straps necessarily need to sell their SDRs for foreign exchange, which comes with an interest, right? So I was just wondering your thoughts on that, like regarding the IMF being able to, because they could also in the same, like the Western countries, I assume, will be trying to indept as much as possible. But the thing is that they won't go through direct indebtment like a bond or a loan or anything like that. It will be more that they trade their SDRs, their excess SDRs, they give away their give away their excess SDRs to Ukraine, so Ukraine can use them then to get foreign currency from the EU, where they might sure still get an interest, but it will increase capital flow into Ukraine for reconstruction purposes. And this can be a very, very high amount. I'm not sure it's appropriate to necessarily be discussing how much, but I do think that it is kind of a, if we're talking about post-war Ukraine, how is reconstruction going on? Like, let's say we set the borders right now, the demographic in the are going to be 1/3 of the women, at least, are going to be coming back, which is basically 1/3 of the refugees. We're talking about then of a country of over 20 billion, and with many of the men killed, the gender imbalance is not necessarily so high. The younger population may very well have been wiped out or maimed to a large extent, so that's definitely going to be an issue. But considering all the civilian aid that is already pledged, and you add on to the IMF, as in not necessarily as a form of benevolence or altruism, but when it pertains to reconstructing Ukraine, for American interests as well, getting the they can funnel that kind of investment into their corporations to be developing the agricultural industry, for example, in Ukraine. And this will be part and parcel of the economy, albeit somewhat unequal. And then we can then bring in the China, who may choose to use their own SCO, their own version of IMF, to kind of counter it, or they will just be sending in their kind of Belt and Road Initiative, and try to then, because the Ukrainians are likely to be still, unless the West really steps up its game, it will be easy for China to provide a better offer that enables them to buy up and get more control in Ukraine. Because now Ukraine is already an open market. Like, the whole country is for sale for the biggest corporations in the world. BlackRock, as already mentioned, but yeah, John Deere from the United States. And so, like, in that regard, like, I don't think it's like absolutely dismal, because at first glance, without China and maybe even Russia, if even possible, I don't know, then I would say, yeah, this looks extremely dismal. But if you have this extra flow of liquidity and otherwise infrastructure support coming into play, which is going to be under the ownership of Western corporations, of course, and interest, but it's still going to be facilitating for the reconstruction in a manner that may make it more feasible for more Ukrainians to return, especially if they're able to kind of get a good setting in the West that enables them to come back to Ukraine as business entrepreneurs or investors. So, like, I'm trying to just kind of find
I think I agree with coping, because there's remember that the scenario we're talking about is that we have a negotiated settlement in the very near future, and the one way that Ukraine can technically leverage its population to come back is just dealing with the West directly. Like, all you need to do, because they're there as refugees, but at the same time, like in Canada, they have, let's say, a 2-year visa. It's going to run out at some point. Now, the longer the war goes on, the slimmer the chances that they will come back. That's basically it. Because right now, a lot of Ukrainians, I know, that come to Canada, they haven't integrated with the society completely, because it's very different from where they're used to a completely new place, new language, everything else. The longer they stay there, the lower the chances of them coming back. So I'm not saying that 1/3 is going to come back or 1/4 is going to come back, but I just know that the longer the war drags on, the percentage just keeps getting smaller and smaller. So that's one very good point, coping, you just made. I want to ask you guys a question about EU itself. So from my understanding, EU has made multiple promises to Ukraine that, hey, the war's going to end, we're going to take you in, or same with the NATO as well. One thing Ukraine desperately needs is a security guarantee after the war is over. And if we're talking about a negotiated peace settlement, we're definitely talking about Ukraine. Ukraine making sure that they do not get invaded again, but at the same time, Russia kind of making sure, unless they completely lose on the battlefield, Russia making sure that Ukraine doesn't join NATO. So that's where there's a conflict of interest. Like they have different interests there, colliding interests actually. Now, what is your opinion? It's going to be a rapid fire question to you guys. Do you guys think that under these circumstances, plus one more thing about EU, if EU does decide to take Ukraine in, there's two things. One, Ukraine has a bigger population than other European countries. So when they go into the European Commission, they will hold more seats in the parliament. They will hold more seats than many other countries, and that gives that could technically threaten the position of Germany and France, and give more power to the Eastern Europe.
One moment. I'm not sure
Second,
that is entirely accurate because I mean Germany has like 80 to 90 million, France has over 60 million, and Ukraine has, as far as I know, at the time moment they had pre-war population close to 40, but now it's almost half. It's like around 20. So I don't think they would be like in the sense of population and voting. That doesn't. But maybe you could clarify that to me.
Yeah. So basically, what happens is that let's take Lithuania for example. They have a 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, I think, something like that population, maybe not. And they hold a certain amount of seats, which is relevant to their population. I know Germany does have, and France does have more bigger populations, but like even 30 billion or 35 billion is 35 million is a huge number of a huge population when compared to rest of the European countries, and that gives a bunch of seats. Like if the Ukraine does become a part of EU, that gives a bunch of seats to Ukraine, which is, I'm not saying that they're going to take over Germany. Germany is much more powerful in European Parliament, but the vote become like these are some extra votes that Poland can take in their side. These are some extra votes. Then Eastern Europe can build its own. Right now, Western Europe holds most of the seats, but Eastern Europe will get more power inside the European Parliament, which may not be to Germany and France's best interest. So that's point one. Point two is that if Ukraine does become part of Europe, European Union, then EU will have to take on the debt of Ukraine. So in terms of that, I'll start with Toby, I guess, since the other two left. Do you think that Ukraine would become, if peace is negotiated, Ukraine would become a part of EU? Keeping that in mind.
That's an interesting question. I think that it is possible, but what you're talking about there is an EU victory over NATO, because I don't think peace can come to Ukraine while NATO rules Europe. I think peace can come to Ukraine if the EU rules Europe. And so there's two different mechanisms by which the people of Western Ukraine could join Europe. One, they could join Europe as a smaller, still pretty large, 20 million people, independent state in the EU, or alternatively, they could get absorbed by Poland, right? As Poland liberates those folks from the evil Russians and makes benefit glorious nation of Palestine. And so Poland absorbing the western part of Europe and Lvov and Volhynia and the rest of it, that's that's a thing. And that would certainly suit NATO, because Poland is way closer to NATO than it is to the EU, right? Poland has always been very, very buddy and friendly with America, still are, and at odds with the rest of Europe. Poland would much prefer to enlarge itself and become more powerful than Germany and France, because it would be much bigger, right? And I think that is definitely on somebody's cards, even if, a lot of people say it's not. So I think if NATO prevail over the EU in terms of that institutional fight, I think that Poland absorbs Lvov and Volhynia. If the EU prevail over NATO, then I think that you could possibly see a client state emerge in the way that you're discussing. How that pans out, how Europe and NATO pan out, and how that struggle pans out, I hesitate to guess. I think it's not being reported widely, but from my experience in Europe, And from what I know, that's a very, very real thing. And as I said, when I see the Nord Stream pipeline, I see NATO attacking the EU. And to some extent, this whole Ukrainian conflict has been about NATO attacking the EU, because let's not make any bones about it. This conflict in Ukraine has given a new lease of life to NATO. It's very much a mafia move, right? It's like, oh, look, someone broke all your windows. You need protection, right? And, and I wasn't involved in that at all much, right? And so this is the thing. NATO has created a circumstance where in the minds of many Europeans, they need NATO. Fantastic for NATO. But don't be deceived, because Europeans are not entirely stupid, right? And there are a great many people who understand exactly what is going on with NATO in Ukraine. And they understand that a European country is being slaughtered, right, because it benefits NATO. And I won't hear this argument that it benefits America, right? And this is why I say I don't believe in countries. The American people are wonderful people. What we're talking about is an institution devoted to profit from war, right? And just quietly, the Russians have their own as well. And so do the Chinese, and everybody does. So I see this question of how the peace pans out. It depends what happens with Europe and NATO. And the reason that I'm not that bullish on NATO's prospects is because I know what Europe is like, and I know that the depth of ill feeling towards NATO is going to be astronomical, not just in Russia, but also within Europe. The Europeans that know what war has been, right? They know what war is. They are seeing this absolute slaughter, and they are seeing the profits being made by NATO. They're seeing Stoltenberg, whom no one voted for, talking as though he's the boss of Europe and that they need him. They know what a mafia is. Mafia is an Italian word, not a Russian one, right? So how this pans out and how the peace pans out, I think, what you're talking about could happen if Europe prevails. But if Europe prevails, that's interesting, because that means the end of NATO.